Coming up, the New York Football Giants continue their search for a defensive coordinator. Mock drafts provide another talking point at the sixth overall pick, and Xavier McKinney finally finds a price point that is or is not too rich for Joe Schoen and the New York Football Giants. We dive in next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant podcast, where we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz, healthy, wealthy, and wise, breaking down the latest news for the New York Football Giants, which we'll get into here in just 1 second. After we tell you that this episode is brought to you by Potential, the New York Football Giants should be sending all of their incoming coaches or draft picks over to Potential because it's a pretty interesting tool that you can use, an online assessment, effectively a survey that sets benchmarks and tracks your well-being and also gives you coaching mechanisms to improve it. And it tracks your progress over time. It's completely free for individual users, and you can check it out today at pietential.com. That's pietential.com. And Andy, as we begin our discussion around the latest for the New York Football Giants, of course, it's defensive coordinator. I don't know if you heard, Wink Martindale is not coming back next year. And so the Giants search is on, and the latest one brings us right back to Buffalo and some ties with both Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen.
Yeah, it does. The Giants have requested an interview with linebackers coach Bobby Babich from the Buffalo Bills, where Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen worked with him. He joined the Bills as an assistant D-backs coach in 2017, coached the safeties, then moved to linebacker. He's coached a whole host of different places, from the Browns and the Panthers to Kent State, Eastern Illinois. He's been around the block quite a bit. But he's held in really, really high regard. The question I have for you, Adam, is how do you feel about the Giants elevating a potential defensive coordinator that has never been one before? Is that concerning to you, knowing that Daboll has been the head coach for 2 years? Or do you think it's necessary given what they just came from in a veteran, outspoken defensive coordinator in Wink Martindale?
Don't forget this little nugget before I give you my response. Babich took over coaching the linebackers in Buffalo for his father, Bob Babich, after the 2021 season when his dad retired. That's just a little feel-good story for you. Listen, on the one hand, you could say yes, because the same way we talk about first-time head coaches, right, compartmentalizing, we're seeing it a little bit firsthand with Brian Daboll, maybe having a hard time letting go of the reins with offensive coordinator Mike Kafka, getting into things around not liking what he's seeing with Wink Martindale and maybe not knowing where to direct his frustration, right? You have a lot more responsibilities. From a defensive perspective, if you're well regarded and you've been coaching one specific position, I'd like to think that you are pretty tethered to what the overall defensive scheme is, what the process is going to be, right? Your linebacker success is also predicated on their ability to complement the secondary, to help out the players in front of them. And I want to think that you're learning underneath McDermott in Buffalo as well. The short answer is no, I don't have any problem with a first-time defensive coordinator coming into the New York Football Giants. Whether or not you think Brian Daboll played a role in it, Wink Martindale is an incredibly experienced defensive coordinator. And while there were successful elements to this defense, we know where they ranked. They were not perfect. So at some point, you need to be willing to do something different. And I think my willingness to take a look at a younger coach or an inexperienced coach, Babich is 40, I tend to be more inclined to go that direction than the retread, because retreads to me sometimes fall down on their own premise too. Well, they've been so good. Yeah, they were so good. That also falls off the edge at some point too. The league moves beyond you at some point. So I'm fine with it. Do you take any issue or have any concerns?
I don't, because smart minds just end up finding their way into these positions. Nobody knew who Bobby Slowick was, who's the offensive coordinator now of the Houston Texans.
Right.
He gets hired and works with CJ Stroud, and all of a sudden he's now, after 1 year, looking at potential head coaching positions for the Washington Commanders and Carolina Panthers and others. What I think is fascinating about the Bobby Babich piece, we don't have to spend too much time on it, but Sean McDermott is a defensive mind. He obviously had Leslie Frazier as his defensive coordinator a year ago. There's some alleged conflicts between the two of them, which made Leslie Frazier step away for a little bit. And Sean McDermott just decided to run the defense himself. So the beat writers in Buffalo are saying the Buffalo Bills have a decision to make. They either need to promote Bobby Babich to be the defensive coordinator or he's going to leave. They are very confident that he is going to get a defensive coordinator position. A lot of them are even saying, like, he's on the short list for being a head coach in the NFL within the next 3 to 5 years. And so, what I find fascinating for Bobby Babich, the individual, is does he want to just stay where he's felt nice and comfortable, where his father coached and he's learned under Sean McDermott, knowing that he's not going to ever really have a full control of the defense? It's always going to be on Sean McDermott. Or does he want to make a switch over, have familiarity with Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen, and let them basically say, this is your opportunity to shape the defense and call the plays the way that you want them to, Bobby?
Well, and that's the difference here for me. Last note would be if you're in his position, there's one thing that's working in your favor of staying in Buffalo, as we know there's some rumblings about McDermott, right? Is he secure in that job? They have another early exit. They lose to the Chiefs again. So on the one hand, you could say, well, if you ride it out, you work for a franchise that has a defensive first coach at the helm, and not a lot of NFL teams do that anymore. So if you ride this out and McDermott does get let go over the next couple seasons, you might be first in line for the interim head coach role, and then you can grow into that. If you have confidence in it and you're Babich, you say, okay, like I'm going to stick this route. The other way to go would be jump, whether it's the Giants or otherwise, take a defensive coordinator role, elevate your profile, right? Show you can do it somewhere else, and then you probably get up to the head of the table when it comes to head coaching jobs. So it does come down to comfort, I think. And it also, if you're the Buffalo Bills, like they're the number one roadblock here. They can just say, hey, you're the DC, congratulations. But it would be an elevation. So Babich does have control, right? You cannot prevent lateral moves. That's fine. But when it's an elevation, it opens up opportunities for a coach to make a decision for himself. So sometimes it comes down to writing on the wall. And last note, real quick, if Babich is close with Frazier and Frazier had disagreements, there is a world where that relationship informs the decisions that Bobby Babich is going to make here as these come up. We will continue to keep an eye on that, as we know it's kind of important that the Giants find a DC here. It will inform decisions they make in free agency and the draft. Will have, obviously, Bobby Okereke to work with. It could be the Bobs. Now, the other thing that happened on the defensive side of the ball recently is this conversation around Xavier McKinney and what we think is going to be the market for him, where's the price point, and whether or not it's viable for Joe Schoen to retain Xavier McKinney, a young 24-year-old safety, a multifaceted, does it in both run and pass defense, very effective player. Nick Filato pointed out this by combining two things, over the cap and also Pro Football Focus. According to Over the Cap, the franchise tag is looking somewhere in the neighborhood of $17.2 million. We've talked about this before. That's a pretty rich tag for any position, let alone safety. Spot Track, however, has McKinney's value at 10.4 million AAV, which, as Nick notes, seems like a little bit of a low figure. Overall, PFF gives you a contract projection at 3 years, 2.5 million AAV, 25 million guaranteed, 37.5 in total value. Where do you land on the idea of the Giants going to the negotiating table with Xavier McKinney and saying, hey, we think 12.5 million AAV is a respectable, solid number, and we'd love to have you back for the next 3 seasons?
What do I think if the Giants say that?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Send that offer letter right over to Xavier McKinney and let him just take it, crumple it up,
Right.
and then like pour some gasoline on it and light it on fire.
Yeah, the
right?
real story here is about how Xavier McKinney reacts to that, not how the Giants feel about it.
The Giants, sure. You want to lock in like a 24-year-old safety who had his best season of the year, 3 interceptions, obviously Pro Football Focus grade of 87.5, which is like Pro Bowl level. Like you're talking about a safety coming into his prime. Why on earth would Xavier McKinney ever accept that number? I think I'll be honest with you.
Okay.
I think everyone has misread this situation drastically with Xavier McKinney. For the idea to even come up that he's going to sign a 3-year deal for $12 million a season makes no sense to me, Adam. It doesn't. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
When we look at, the average salary, the highest paid safeties in the league, Derwin James makes $19 million. Minkah Fitzpatrick makes $18.2. Jamal Adams makes $17.5. Now you may say the Jamal Adams one is a huge mistake. I would agree on that as well. But then you have what I think is the most interesting comp is Falcons safety Jesse Bates. Jesse Bates is making $16 million a year. Jesse Bates had a 90 Pro Football Focus rating. He was amazing this year for the Atlanta Falcons. Jesse Bates was 25, turning 26 years old when he signed his deal last offseason with the Falcons. He signed a 4-year, $64 million deal. So, like, you're talking about 24/25 years old, emerging free agent on the open market. How is Xavier McKinney going to look around and say, they're going to offer me less than top 10 money at my position when it's my time to get paid at the age that I am? Look at Jesse Bates. How am I worth $4 million less when inflation goes up? I played well and it's my turn to get paid. So, Adam, I turn it back to you and say,
Yes, sir.
there's no way that Xavier McKinney, in my opinion, signs anything under $15 million annually. And he's probably going to expect 4 years instead of 3, right?
Well, so yeah, there's two parts. The little short term thing is the 3 year, right? Again, this isn't trying to negotiate with Saquon Barkley a year ago and trying to avoid using the tag on him because he's a running back and the age factor and where the franchise is and all that stuff. Like we understand kind of what goes into that. The other thing that you noted there that I think is really important, you said, not even top 10 money because the 10th highest paid is Quandre Diggs, who's averaging 13 million, right? A $39 million contract. Now he's 29 years old. So he's a little bit on the older side. So a little bit on the older side and making 13 million. 12.5 would slot him in as the 11th highest paid, just ahead of Jalen Thompson, who's 24 years old, just ahead of Delpit, who's also 25 years old, making 12 million. And if you think about any other free agents that may come up here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, combined with the NFL is making more money, the salary cap is going up. To your point, yes, to the way Nick Filato framed it, yes, $12.5 million does feel like a good number, right? Like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. I would pay $37 million over 3 years for the services of Xavier McKinney. But why would he? And the interesting thing here is, unlike with Saquon Barkley, where you try to negotiate, it doesn't work out, and they tag you. Well, the Giants aren't tagging you, Xavier McKinney, right? And he knows that. And this is positive for McKinney again. They're not going to spend 17.2 million on a 1-year tag for you. They have other positions of need. They still going to try to figure out Saquon Barkley again, right? Everything else they need to add here. So, at least in my opinion right now, if these are the numbers, if this is where the Giants feel comfortable, if you're going to offer him less than 13 million and less than probably 4 years, I would assume that Xavier McKinney is going to say, my plan is to go to market. The Giants are going to say, we really can't afford to tag you. And then it becomes interesting, right? What teams are out there that are going to be willing to pay him that $15+ million? Maybe if there's a good relationship with the Giants, say, hey, I got to 13.5, I got to 14, right? Let the market dictate the number to you, and the Giants can make that decision. How high, after we say 12.5 sounds great, how high would you be willing to go then? If you're talking about 17.2 on the tag, we can't do that. We couldn't possibly. You can backload money on a 4-year contract, right? You can manipulate how that cap hit works. How high would you go, AAV?
I mean, I don't see a world where the Giants go more than, geez, I don't know, 4 for 60. Like, you're talking about $15 million annually. Like, I just don't see how the Giants can go above that given the current situation. And that would put him right in between sixth or seventh highest paid safety between Justin Simmons and Buda Baker. To me, that feels like probably the highest that you'd want to go to retain your own guy. And remember, Adam, yes, you would be letting a young, emerging talent out the door at safety. But then you also probably will get a 3rd-round compensation pick if he decides to sign elsewhere. But to me, locking in that much money at the safety position seems like a really tough thing. But I will say, maybe this is the reason why they let Julian Love leave it last offseason, knowing they can only allocate a certain amount of money at the safety position. And they wanted to do that with Xavier McKinney, not Julian Love.
Well, and I am very curious about it too, because like I just want to click through because Xavier McKinney, right now that entire room makes $5 million. The entire safety room, including Dane Belton, Javarius Owens, and Jason Pinnock, right? So all there's no money being spent in the short term. And it's actually the other factor here. You mentioned about letting Julian Love go because maybe you're thinking about Xavier McKinney, but then you go out and you get Pinnock off the practice squad from the Jets, and he comes in and plays really well. So now if you're looking down the line, you're saying, well, where do we stand here? if we invest 15 million in Xavier McKinney right now, what happens with Pinnock? I'll tell you, he leaves, right? Like, you're not going to end up investing significant money in him as well. So how do you feel about Dane Belton? How do you feel about Pinnock? And whether or not you think a couple of years from now, we could be talking about a different set of safeties at that position as well. But I was just, out of curiosity, I wanted to update the safety position and see if anybody else had larger numbers. So, for example, the Cleveland Browns would be a good example here, right? Safety position, they have Delpit. He's one of the top paid guys, 12 million. They're also paying 7 million to Thornhill in that safety room. So they're already up to 19. And then they have a smattering of other guys that effectively take them to 22, 23 million dollars. So position allocation could also play a factor in this as well for the New York Football Giants over the life of this contract. What happens with Belton, what happens with Pinnock matters here. But if in total we're still only paying out under 18 million for our entire safety room, that can be a factor, right? I mean, at least if you think you're going to then cycle out some of these guys and go back to the draft to refill.
I mean, it almost makes sense for the Giants to negotiate with Jason Pinnock on a long-term deal now than it does Xavier McKinney. Jason
Right.
Pinnock has 1 year left on his deal. If you let Xavier McKinney walk, talk about how much money you're going to have to pay Jason Pinnock, because you just literally have nothing behind him other
Right.
than Javarius Owens and Dane Belton, as we mentioned before. So for me, don't you kind of think? I think that Xavier McKinney is going to say, "I lost my coordinator. I've had a tumultuous time here a little bit where, like, I haven't been happy. I've been frustrated." Like, couldn't you see him just saying, "Hey, the Commanders have $90 million in cap space. If they want to pay me $17 million a year, I'll drive down 95 and take the money." Like, I, I see that as a likely outcome. So why not protect yourself and say, "Hey, Jason Pinnock, what if we do like a 3-year, $21 million deal with you right now? And we get you for $7 million a year. We lock you in to make sure that you're here. And then we deal with Xavier McKinney getting the comp pick later." Like that, I think, is actually a realistic outcome.
Well, let me be clear here. I don't disagree with you, and this is also important because Xavier McKinney, like, this is his payday. Remember, he fell out of the first round. It was a big steal for the New York Football Giants. They felt great about it. If you go and negotiate with Pinnock on a long term deal, Xavier McKinney's leaving. Like, Xavier McKinney is not going to sit there and be like, I know we have you on the docket. Let us just try to sort something out here. It's unrelated to you, buddy. It has nothing to do with you and your contract.
Well,
But
it's
no,
leverage. It's
it's
leverage.
good business. It's good business. I'm just saying, if you want to go that route, then I think you are probably increasing the percentage chances of retaining Xavier McKinney from about, you're taking it from 85%. It's your choice. He's your guy, and dropping it down to 35%. He's committed to walking out the door and testing the market.
Listen, first one that takes the good deal gets to be the Giants safety for the foreseeable future. Guys, work it out amongst yourselves. Hey, if you both want to be back, let's put our heads together. Let's get 2 multi-year deals going. I'm just saying the Giants should not be left holding the bag, kind of like they were in the secondary this year after losing James Bradbury, Adoree Jackson not looking great. They need to make these contingency plans early. They're
Yeah.
probably going to have to draft a safety. They're probably going to have to look at what's going to happen with Pinnock, especially if they don't sign Xavier McKinney to a long-term deal.
Maybe they all walk and you just have Javarius Owens and Dane Belton. The future is bright. Now, when we turn our attention over to what we framed here as rising draft stock, mostly because multiple mocks have come out here. Mel Kiper's been front and center in them. Mel Kiper's actually, in the last, I think, 3 days, gone from saying one wide receiver to the New York Football Giants to a completely different one. And it's the different one. It's the second one that I found a little bit interesting. So the latest full 32 pick first round mock came out from Mel Kiper. There's a few other outlets too as well, by the way. And there's a lot of consensus around the 6th overall pick. So they have it here where Chicago's staying put. They're going with Caleb Williams. Justin Fields is going to go play wherever he's going to go play. Washington goes with Jaden Daniels. The Patriots go with Drake May. So let's assume, even if the Giants did want to move up in the draft, all these teams are saying, like, we need our guy. We're going to stay put. We're going to take our guys. Marvin Harris Jr., the clear number one, not only wide receiver, but arguably number one talent in the draft, goes to the Cardinals. And then the Chargers, they get into the waters that I've mentioned here a couple of times with Brock Bowers at the number 5 spot. It brings us to number 6. It brings us to Malik Neighbors. And obviously, we understand the agenda here, right? The Giants still need to add more talent. If the messaging is we're committed to having Daniel Jones come back and be healthy, he needs more weapons. We know we have 3rd-round pick in Jalen Hyatt. We saw Wan'Dale Robinson take a little step forward here. We're kind of concerned around what's going to happen with Darren Waller at the tight end spot. We don't know about Saquon Barkley either, right? So more weapons, more weapons, more weapons. Is Neighbors the guy though? Because I look at the situation, the measurables. He's incredibly talented. Let's be very clear here. I'm not knocking the kid, but from every single standpoint, we talked about Odunze the other day. That's the guy. He's a top 10 talent. If you're going wide receiver, I'm a little confused why you go with a model of player that seems to check like 80% of the boxes when there's another guy there that checks 99.9 of them.
So I have been on the Roman Dunze train for quite a while, like midseason. You see all of the traits that NFL,
Starts in Washington, ends in New York. That's that train.
yeah. Imagine that. Imagine that's the starting spot for him. But listen, he is 15 pounds bigger than Malik Neighbors. He is 3 inches taller. He runs a faster 40. Those
Yep.
are just some of the characteristics that people look at and say he's bigger, faster, stronger.
Yes.
Okay, I like that. He plays inside and outside, which I like. The issue that I have that I keep going back and forth on is like I think we forget sometimes how good Malik Neighbors was during the regular season.
Yep.
Jaden Daniels had a few like 6 or 7 touchdown games against like Southwest Tennessee, Missouri State University. And so you're like, oh, what does that really matter? But when you look at what Malik Neighbors did in some of the biggest games, they played Alabama. Yes, they lost that game, but he had 10 catches for 171 yards and a
Yep.
touch. Like, that's pretty legit. When you look at Missouri, who was a really, really good team that they beat this year, he had 6 catches for 146 yards, Adam. He had 24 yards per reception, which is insane. He obviously had 100 yards against Arkansas, 100 yards against Mississippi. He had 132 yards against Florida State, and then against Mississippi State, he had 13 catches for 239 and 2 touchdowns. Like, it's tough when you look at that production and like you think it's against some like cream puff teams and you're like it's against SEC teams. He was just destroying people. It makes me kind of flip-flop back and forth and say, what matters more, the traits or the production? And that's really going to be the question for any team that's picking within the top 5 or top 6 of these high-end picks.
Well, and here's an interesting part about this too, because I agree with you, right? And again, like the model of player, I tend to go towards Odunze, but understanding it's not a knock on Neighbors, and it's not saying that they took Neighbors. I wouldn't be elated, right? He's an electric talent, and it's funny when you talk about like the measurables. Neighbors comes in 91st percentile in hands. His short receiving, 100%. His intermittent, 100% routes. Deep threat, 100%. Blocking, he's only 70% in blocking. That one certainly is going to drop him down a little bit in my book. And the reason why I say it is because Odunze is also a very good talent, but 86, 88, 92, 93, 66 in all of those same categories. Marginal differences that you look at when you're trying to parse out between these two receivers. The other fascinating thing to me is, and this is something you get in the combine, who do they stack up against? Who do they compare to? If you want to talk about pedigree and the way players are being projected, Neighbors comes out. Here's 3 comparisons. You tell me if you like them or don't like them. Now, this is funny. Chris Olave, solid. Smaller receiver, but very solid player so far. He's had some injuries. Kadarius Toney. Well, that's gonna strike a chord with the New York Football Giants fan base. But then the number one comparison, Jamar Chase. Oh, okay. If you tell me I get a Jamar Chase type player, well, then I'm certainly signing up for it. And I mention it because when you flip over Cedric Tillman, Andre Iosivas, who went to the Bengals as well. He's a guy that we talked about in last year's draft class. Terrence Marshall Jr. Those are the ones that get mentioned with the Dunze. So again, this is probably to me, from an optics standpoint, you see, right? You see where people are pigeonholing these players. And I often wonder, how much does it have to do with some of those high profile games that really matter? The school that you played at, right? And just the perceived value of who you are. The fact that Odunze is now considered a top 10 pick and in that neighborhood is actually a massive compliment to what he's accomplished here. And I just wonder if that's what it is right now. Either you're going with the known commodity, the sexy name that was established there long ago, or this other player that has surprised you a little bit. And sometimes it takes a little bit more to come around. This is where the combine is critical, because this is where a guy like Odunze, all of a sudden you go, oh, well, he looks as good, maybe better than a player higher up the board in Neighbors, right? And that's where you start to have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you didn't mention Odell Beckham Jr. as the comp for Malik Neighbors, because everyone seems to do that because Odell's 5'11",
Played at
Neighbors
the
is
same
6 foot,
school.
both
Yeah.
went to LSU, both had electric production. Like
Mhm.
I'm surprised, but those comps are kind of scary. The fact that like Olave is considered a Pro Bowl type player. Jamar Chase is considered one of the three best wide receivers. We know what Kadarius Toney is. And then like Roman Dunze's comps are like guys that could be out of the league in 12 months. Like that to me is relatively scary if they're like, yeah, these are how we project them. Like this person could be all world. This one may not ever get on the field again. That's not a good comp for like a top 5, top 7 pick.
And by the way, remember, like a guy in Kadarius Toney, like remember what he was thought to be when he came in the league when the Giants drafted him, right? Whether or not it was good, bad move, they should have traded back. You had guys that wanted him, right down with the Jacksonville Jaguars, made mistakes, fine. But he was projected as being a first-round talent and a guy that was going to be explosive and dynamic. So, end of the day, it comes down to development. It comes down to how you are dedicated to developing your game and your craft, the team you get drafted to, et cetera, down the line. The biggest thing I like about Odunze is his versatility. 30 of his catches came out of the slot. He has a full command of route tree combinations. Again, doesn't take away from what Neighbors is and what he can be, because guess what? Maybe I just line up on the outside and I absolutely crush, right? Like maybe I don't need, it doesn't mean he can't, but it's like I don't need to do anything else. I'm so good at this. I don't need to do the other stuff. I like versatility. Interesting to see where that goes. Obviously, long way before the draft. Last one for us here, Andy. Little fun conversation here. A year ago, the New York Football Giants went to the playoffs, won a playoff game, and there was a general sense of jubilation around the fan base. They also then elected to pay Daniel Jones a large amount of money. Down south, now in Florida, you got Tampa Bay Buccaneers pretty much on a similar type of track when it comes to one Baker Mayfield. Went to the playoffs, won a playoff game, and now it's time for him to potentially get paid. Conversations are that he could be looking in the neighborhood of $40+ million on this deal to potentially return to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Run me through this here, because this is kind of your conversation that I'm just going to confirm or deny the validity of.
Okay, so I find it fascinating the scenario that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers find themselves in, especially following the Giants as closely as we do, Adam. You look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, weren't necessarily expected to be amazing. Well, they were in cap hell, literally in cap hell. They had the most dead cap of any team in the league, $81 million in dead cap, which meant they had no money to spend. And so when they thought about what they were going to do at quarterback, they decided to pick up Baker Mayfield off the street after being on, 3 teams over the last 12 months, essentially, and getting, outright released at some point. Like he was kind of left for gone at that point. And they signed Baker Mayfield to a 1-year, $4 million deal. And a funny thing happened for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers where, they were actually competitive, even with all of that dead cap and not being able to spend money. They went 9-8, made the playoffs, and won a playoff game. And now they're at the fork in the road where they have a quarterback who seems to have done pretty good, but most people don't think is a Pro Bowl caliber player necessarily. And now they have the decision to make if they want to pay him $40 to $45 million a year on a multi-year deal, as well as figuring out what they do with their 30-year-old Pro Bowl wide receiver in Mike Evans, who's going to be expected to make $20 to $22 million a year. And I find it interesting because don't you feel like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are at a similar inflection point to what the Giants were after they won against the Minnesota Vikings, where it's like, okay, do we re-sign all of our players and give this another go? Or do we change things knowing that we kind of reached what our ceiling was with the current players on the roster?
No. I mean, like I'll offer this disagreement in that, yes, go to the playoffs unexpectedly based on where they were at the start of the season, win a game, obviously really exciting. There's a couple of differences for me. One, the reason why they were in cap hell is because they had Tom Brady and they were trying to win championships and they accomplished that goal. But they were in cap hell because they had tremendous talent, right? The Giants were in cap hell really because of a ton of terrible decision making by the part of Dave Gettleman and who they chose to pay and how this roster was constructed, right? So that's the first, like, where this is where the road starts to divide. Then when you go a layer deeper on it in terms of choosing to pay guys or not. Now you can debate about Mike Evans. I think he's a fascinating one with his age. He's been so productive, but like it feels like everyone is just like, he's never going to make it. He's never going to make it to 31. It's impossible. But when you are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and you play with the Saints, the Falcons, and the Panthers, as opposed to the Giants, who play with the Cowboys, the Eagles, and we know the Commanders, obviously, and to different degrees about where these teams are going to head in the upcoming seasons. It's a far less competitive division in the NFC South, at least as it looks right now. Saints are a good team, but they're kind of the same boat. We got Derek Carr. Is that really an all-pro caliber quarterback? No, but we have some things. Our defense is strong. The outlook in the short term for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers gives them an opportunity to compete for the division, probably going forward over the next couple of seasons. The Giants, as we've seen, are further away from that. The roster construction is not there. Now, what happens with their free agents, Mike Evans and all these things? Yeah, that matters. But I just think the core of what this team was a very good football team. And then you brought in Baker Mayfield, and it lowered the standard from Tom Brady level to Baker Mayfield level. And Baker Mayfield level was making the playoffs, winning a game, and that's as far as you could go. And just the last note here, too, when you think about that team and where they're going to go, what can they accomplish if it isn't Mike Evans? How can they continue to improve this team going forward and utilize the draft as well? Just like we talk about with the Giants.
So I will give you a little bit of pushback. I don't think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were a great team. I think they
No.
were an okay team, a decent team. They had a winner get in scenario in the last game of the season against the Carolina Panthers, who were fledgling, and I think they won 9-0. Right? I don't think they scored a touchdown. It
Crushed it.
was
Shutout. It was a shutout.
it was a shutout in terms of touchdowns for both teams in the entire game. It
That's right.
was what it was. And, they kind of snuck in. It felt like they got the worst version of the Philadelphia Eagles after the Giants just bludgeoned them in the last game of the season. Like, it just, Philly was a detriment. Adam, $81 million in dead cap for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last year.
Cooking.
Fast forward to this year, they go from the most dead cap in the NFL to the least dead cap in the NFL. They only have $200,000 worth of dead cap. To go from 81 to 200,000 is tremendous. So you may sit there and say, we've got some cap space to burn to improve this team. But we mentioned Baker Mayfield's going to take up $40 million plus on a multi-year deal. He's getting it from someone. Mike Evans is going to get $20 million a year. He's been the most productive wide receiver easily in your franchise's history. Not to mention 25-year-old Antoine Winfield Jr., their prized free agent safety, is hitting the market after having an all-pro level type of season. They are either going to have to franchise tag him for $17 or $18 million a year, or he's going to be getting $18, $19 million annually. So when you're talking about 20-something for Evans, 19 for Winfield, 40 for Baker,
Sure.
all of a sudden that money that was dead cap just gets reallocated to having the same team. How do you improve this team? Isn't that kind of what the Giants just went through after re-upping Daniel Jones, franchise tagging Saquon Barkley, and not having big-time money to be able to move chips around on the table?
Yeah, 100%. Again, it's not a perfect scenario, right? And I'm not putting Tampa Bay, right? They were in the back end towards the 20s in terms of offensive and defensive rankings. Like, they're not a perfect team, but but again, the Giants, the Giants went and made the playoffs. But we knew they were a flawed team. Like, we knew, and so is Tampa Bay. But we knew there were so many holes. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have an offensive line. They have one. Guess what? That kind of effing matters, right? So, yeah, having to bring back your Pro Bowl safety, obviously. But if they make all those decisions, and I want to get to another decision they could make here too. But if they get to all those decisions, they bring back Mike Evans, they keep the band together. They have an offensive line. They have a decent running game. They have solid weapons. So even though the rankings don't look great, again, this decision for Tampa Bay isn't, hey, we're going all in. We're going to win a championship over the next contract for Baker Mayfield. It's, hey, we are not going to go into obscurity. Our division is winnable. We're going to keep being that team that can win 9, sometimes 10 games and go to the playoffs. Because guess what? It's going to take Carolina another 2 years to be high-level competitive. You don't know where the Saints are definitely heading the direction of their team right now. They have big decisions to make. The Falcons, now that's a big curiosity, right? They could be one Bill Belichick hire away from absolutely destroying this division. But that's where they're at. This is why the decisions aren't in a vacuum. It's not just, oh, do you want to spend all this money if you're any team? Well, if you're certain teams, yes. If you're the Giants, you make the case no. And last but not least, not that I'm here to drag Daniel Jones through the mud, but he is not even at Baker Mayfield's level at this point. When you go and look at the numbers, Baker Mayfield is not a perfect quarterback. I think his little stint with the Rams last year was absolutely critical for him. It's like McVay just went ahead and gave him little tweaks, just little tweaks to make you a better quarterback. He has proven that he can be a winning quarterback. Daniel Jones has flashed that, right? He's flashed that one time. And I just don't. I don't. I think you agree. These are not apples to apples situations between the Giants and the Bucks. These are two teams, one of which has had a successful track record of working through championship eras and out of them and resetting their dead cap and all those things. And the other one is one that hasn't been able to fix its offensive line in a decade and always seems to be fledgling in what direction they're going.
I completely appreciate that. I just keep in mind the Tampa Bay Buccaneers lost to teams like the Bills, the 49ers, the Lions, like the teams that are still there or were competing in the playoffs, and they beat the Panthers twice, the Falcons, the Saints. Like they're beating. It's the same thing that people said about the Giants. Like how many winning teams did the Giants face last year? I just see like the situation that the Giants found themselves in, and then fast forward 12 months, and you're like, it was an abject failure. What happened this season? I worry that if they just decide to roll it back and use that dead cap to push over to the players that they have, that it will look eerily similar to what happened with the Giants. And all of a sudden you're like, huh, we have Baker Mayfield for 3 more years and $120 million. Like, what did we do to ourselves here? Fooling ourselves into we have a team that can compete for and win playoff games consistently.
Yeah, of course. Vikings, Bears, Saints, Titans, Panthers, Falcons, Packers, Jaguars, and Panthers again. That's where the winning comes from here, right? So, to your point, all the other losses are against good teams and they won against average or bad teams 100%. And that's the boat the Giants are in. And I guess, hey, a year from now, I won't be shocked if Tampa Bay is a 7-win team, right? Like
Right.
I'm not saying they're going to be a 9-10 win team and go back to the playoffs 100%.
Right. What if
But
Tampa wins 6 games? Baker Mayfield looks like he did for more of his career than he did this season, and all of a sudden you're like, we now have this quarterback under contract for 4 years. It feels like I'm having PTSD for them specifically because we just went through this and saw what happened with Daniel Jones. And to your point, Baker Mayfield's slightly more accomplished, a little bit of a higher passer rating, a little bit better touchdown to interception ratio than Daniel Jones. So he's slightly better than Daniel Jones so far to this point. But like, man, they have a lot of similar decisions to the Giants, which is fascinating because they're coming off a very positive season where they ended up winning a playoff game.
yeah, 100%. And listen, maybe that's what it is. You mentioned PTSD. You can also just think about it as like what happens with the Buccaneers will maybe from afar make the Giants fan base feel better or worse, right? Hey, everybody makes mistakes, but the obscurity of not having a defined quarterback is critical. That's what Tampa Bay is deciding right now. And we'll get into because there's also a new article out from on ESPN Plus talking about landing spots for all the impending free agency. Kirk Cousins is one of those guys on that list as well. So we can certainly go into that category too here and say, what does it look like? What direction are some of these franchises going to go? And who's going to be available for teams to improve themselves? I wanted to just get this up here real quick before we got out the door because you said slightly better. And I'm not here to, throw shade at anybody. Baker Mayfield has 130 touchdowns in his career and 74 interceptions. Daniel Jones has 62 touchdowns and 40 picks. Like, I just brass tacks on some very simple numbers, injuries and otherwise. Baker Mayfield is a far more accomplished quarterback than Daniel Jones is. Doesn't mean this year can't be a whole different story for Jones, but that's where it's at. And if you're talking about paying $40 million to a quarterback, I'm not saying I would for Baker, but I would pay Baker before I would have paid Daniel Jones that same type of money. And that's where the Giants find themselves. Guys. This was a jam-packed episode. We talked about a lot of things. McKinney money and whether or not the Giants will retain him. Is Neighbors the ultimate goal here for the Giants in the draft? And frankly, do we have any coaches? A lot of things got broken down here for you. And then also, apparently, Andy and I have a real obsession with Baker Mayfield and what happens next for him. The bottom line is you get over to YouTube at One Giant Podcast. You get us on Twitter at One Giant Podcast, at Adam Armbrecht and at Andy Mac 214. We're going to be breaking down coming up. We have the playoff picture. Our pick'ems has been going on. I've been incredibly successful with it. And we'll also take a look at some of these impending free agents, landing spots, and whether or not we think the Giants should start to get into those waters as they have a little bit more money to work with than years prior under Joe Schoen. Until next time, Andrew. As you would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.